welcome back to the Creating Synergy podcast. Today we have the wonderful man, Mr. David Panter on the show. Welcome.
Glad to be here.
So David, you're the current CEO of the Minda Group, the former CEO of the ECH Group, the former CEO of Central Adelaide Local Health Network, plus many, many more CEO roles, prestigious CEO roles here in South Australia and over in the UK. Welcome to the show, and what do we need to know about your earliest context to understand the person who's sitting in front of us today?
I think probably the most important thing is that two elements. One is that I come from a very traditional working class family in the UK, from the middle of England. My dad was a lorry driver. I was the first one in my family to have the opportunity to go to university. And so that singled me out within the family. But also I came out as being gay at about 15 in the early 1970s in the UK. And so that also probably sort of defined my early years. But the two together in terms of my identity around being gay, but also coming from that working class background and my dad was a strong trade unionist. Yeah. And so most of my core values, I think I inherited and learnt from him.
So what were they? I mean, one of my questions here actually is, describe your parents to me and let's understand a little bit more about them and who they were and how they raised you.
Again, it's one of those interesting things that when I came to Australia 20 years ago, it took me a long time to understand some of the politics, and particularly around the Australian Labor Party, because it just felt very different to my understanding. I mean, I've never been a member of a political party, but certainly my dad was a strong trade unionist and was a shop steward in a trade union and very aligned with Labour and always voted Labour in the UK. But in the UK, that Labour tradition, certainly for my dad, came out of more of the sort of non-conformist Methodist approach, whereas what I discovered here is a much stronger affiliation between Labour and Catholicism in Australia. And so so for me, those non-conformist Methodist values of being community focused, not having a lot of pomp and circumstance. It's a very plain religion and very plain chapel approach, and none of the mystifying stuff. So basically good values of belief in people and belief in community and doing right by others, doing to others as you would have done to yourself. When I told my parents that I was gay, so this was, the mid-70s, so only a few years after, homosexuality wasn't legalised in the UK to 1969, so it was only a few years after that. The reaction from my parents was, given their background, given the times, was quite amazing. My mother said, "Oh yes, I know all about that, it's something to do with the genes." And my father's response was, "Well, it must be your side of the family because I'm from good breeding stock." And that was it.
That was it.
That was done and dusted. There was no other issues. I wasn't
rejected. How old were you?
I was about sort of 15, 16.
Yeah. How difficult was that for you, given especially, in the 70s, and I do know later that Thatcher she come out and put some laws against that. So tell us about that whole decision of coming out and how that was for you at that time.
At the time I didn't feel it to be traumatic at all. Again, I have a strong belief that you develop a frame of reference or a way of operating, and ideally that can transfer from one scenario to another. And so I was, as a young child, up until the age of 5, I was underweight, and then after 5, I became very overweight and was through most of my childhood. So I developed a resilience, if you like, to being called a fatty. And so then to being called a puff didn't really make much difference.
Water off the duck's back.
And I was a strong personality. Again, to give you some context, I went to a sort of classic UK comprehensive school there were just under 1,500 kids in the school. I was the only one that had identified as being gay. One of my friends, Ronnie, was the only Afro-Caribbean out of all of that. So it sort of there was a gang of us that were actually felt a bit like outsiders, but took comfort and support from each other. And when I look back on it now, I just think it was an amazing experience. And there was one point where I did get quite low, and it did impact on my sort of academic activity. And that got noticed by teachers. And the head teacher at the school, Mr. Rumbelow, invited me into the office. He knew that I'd come out as being gay. And he just said, look, David, it does not matter what you, in his words, what you do in bed with somebody. You're a person first. And that's all that we're interested in, is to make sure that you're the best person you can be. And again, to have got that response
what an amazing,
in that age, it was just amazing. And just as well, really, because a year or so later, when I was going down the path potentially of going into nursing, I was working as a nursing assistant in the local hospital, and Mr. Rumbelow came off his motorbike and spent a few weeks in the ward I was working in. So I had to rub cream on his bottom most days.
So, well, at least you took care of, I mean, because he could have gone down another path, which might have...
Absolutely. And I, I was so oblivious to everything that was going on and what the upset it might be for other people. And it was only when I went back to a school union, probably when I was around about 30, and some of the teachers that I was very close to, of course, by then I realised that actually they were only a few years older than me, because they were in their first teaching jobs, 22-year-olds. And they then shared with me at that reunion how agonised they were, because they'd never experienced somebody coming out, and they just didn't know what to do. And so, again, I was oblivious to all of that, but together they created an amazing environment along with my sort of home environment. So I don't feel that it was a particularly traumatic experience for me.
Yeah, fabulous. Did you, I mean, we were talking off air, we were talking about loneliness, right? And we won't go into the subject that we were talking about there, but did you feel, because you said out of the 1,500 students, you were the only one that came out and said that you're gay, did you feel a sense of loneliness, not being able to share and connect with anyone else in that way, or?
No, because I think that there was a number of us who, for different reasons, felt as outsiders. And so we had our own gang, if you like. And it was, and I think I did develop that sense of robustness in my personality, in my approach, what I was prepared to give ground on, what I wasn't prepared to in terms of my values. And people responded incredibly positive. I can remember going to the school social club on a Thursday evening and literally going up to some of the people who, again, were friends, but I wasn't particularly close to, who were the classic high school jocks in the soccer team, that sort of thing. And I would say to them, "You should kiss me," and they did. I mean, not in a passionate way, but they didn't react to it in an adverse way. And so, I think that was part of just the presence I had. I was in some ways a very typical young gay boy in that I was into amateur dramatics. I was always in the school play.
Which is very endearing, right? And people like being around people who are charismatic, and so that's great. Do you, later on, I think it was in the late 80s, was it 80s, when Margaret Thatcher came out and changed the law? Is that correct? So how did that affect you in any way?
Well, I think that, again, from my days of coming out in the sort of mid-70s, and then had always been very sort of active politically in that sense, around sort of campaigning. And when I went to university, that carried on. When I was at university, that's when things like the miners' strike in the UK was happening. There is a very good film people might have seen called Pride, which is about how the gay community in London rallied around the miners and collected donations and then actually went to a Welsh village to hand over the donated money to support them, and the culture clash there. And it was an amazing film to watch because that felt very much like my experience at the time. I was part of the group that was raising funds for the miners. And so was very sort of anti-Thatcher. And so later on, when she brought in the laws to prevent homosexuality being promoted in schools or by any sort of government body, then yes, it was awful. But there was significant action in the community to try and actually deal with that and respond to that in various ways. And so that sort of political activism, because you can't divorce that from the arrival in the early 80s of HIV and AIDS and all of the impact that had on the gay male community in particular. And my early career was founded in that world. That was my very first job in the health service, was working in HIV and AIDS.
Because that's what you said. You said you sort of, in a previous conversation, you've said to me that you sort of just ended up in the healthcare. Can you talk us through how all that came about? And obviously had a substantial input into the early part of the HIV AIDS piece in the UK.
So, I mean, as I said earlier on, I wasn't doing great academically. I was concerned about, therefore, what I was going to do. I had applied to university to do a degree in experimental psychology, didn't think I was going to get the grades, and lined up a backup to go and do nursing. And again, this was the late 70s, so men in nursing wasn't that common. And the matron who interviewed me at the time for that degree program in nursing, one of the first in the UK, insisted that I go and get some practical experience because they were concerned about whether I'd actually want to wash people's hair and do all the manual care. So that's how I ended up in the hospital, the local hospital, and had that interaction with my previous head teacher. Anyway, I didn't get the grades for the psychology, but Sussex University rang me up and said, "You interviewed really well, we'd still like to offer you the position." Great. Thought I'd do that and then I can go and do nursing afterwards. Did my undergraduate degree, did reasonably well. People said you should do a PhD. I said, well, okay, I'll do a PhD and then I'll go and do the nursing. And the PhD, it was when, again, Thatcher, who had very strong views that society didn't exist and community didn't matter. It was all about individuals. And that that became real for her in terms of abolishing, at the time I was applying for a PhD, all of the research money for the social sciences.
Wow.
And so virtually no university in the UK had actually funds for psychology PhDs. One of the few organisations that did was the Open University. And the Open University, the original in the UK, very different to the one here in Australia. It's all pre-internet, and the Open University is a real academic institution. It has a campus in Milton Keynes in the middle of England, and the only difference between that and other universities is that campus doesn't have lecture theatres because all of the teaching was done through distance teaching through the mail, but also as part of the university was the BBC, the British Broadcasting Company, and so we had studios because the way they taught was by making television programs and radio programs that went out in the middle of the night when there was nothing else on television. And the mature students then used to study via that. They had their own money. They gave me a PhD scholarship. And so I went into my PhD there. And that meant that as with more traditional PhD students, you're expected to teach. But at the Open University, that was about making television programs, radio programs, distance teaching of mature students, running summer schools, those sorts of things. So I got a whole skill set that when I finished my PhD and was then thinking about what next, I was offered the opportunity to stay in academia, but there was no research money. And particularly as my PhD was in child social relations and gender development, was not going to be something that was going to attract funding. And so it just so happened that that's when the NHS, and it was one part of the NHS in London, that advertised a position for what was called an AIDS information officer first job of its kind in the National Health Service in the UK, and I managed to get it.
Yeah, very good.
Despite the fact that, again, to give you context, this was the era of the new romantic music movement, the sort of early days of Culture Club, Boy George.
Yeah.
So at the time, my hair was quite long, curly, with lots of rags braided into it. I used to wear black tights and a tartan miniskirt.
There you go.
And Dr. Martin boots.
Yeah.
Which I went to interview like that.
They come back, the Doc Martin boots.
Exactly. And this amazing woman, Dr. Leela Lessoff, who unfortunately died a few months ago, gave me the job. And so that job was about working with gay men and injecting drug users around the streets of London on trying to, enable them to prevent becoming infected, but if they did become infected, how to then handle that. And that's how I got sucked into the health system, because I very quickly then moved on from that role to creating services. And so I was part of the group that created the first inpatient service around HIV and AIDS at St Mary's Hospital in London.
So are you a doctor then? Doctor?
So I am. Yes. So I've got a PhD. So I'm technically Dr. David Panter. I never used the title until I came to Australia.
Yeah.
And then when I worked for started working for SA Health, everybody insisted I had to use the title whereas in the NHS I never used it.
Because in all the articles, nothing ever refers to as Dr. David Panter. But a lot of articles written about you.
So I'm very grateful that I had the experience of getting the PhD.
Yeah, absolutely.
But I don't use the title.
I've seen, the movies. That's kind of my only context to sort of the 70s and 80s of what happened in that time. How rife was the AIDS, HIV situation at the moment? Was it in those era?
It was just awful. The impact was completely devastating. Again, if you want to get a really good sense, because I think it's the best thing I've seen in recent years, there's a drama series called It's a Sin that is written by Russell T Davies, who has written lots, Queer as Folk, and then a lot of the Doctor Who revival is all down to him. And it's about a group of young gay men in the 80s arriving at university in London, and then AIDS arriving.
Yeah. Okay.
And for me, that captured absolutely. And there's one young man in that who gets HIV, becomes ill, and there's some really grueling scenes of him going into hospital, and it's that classic, what I would call a Florence Nightingale ward, just the big ward with like 30 beds in, 15 down each side. Yeah. He is the only person in there, and the door is locked, and people will only go in with huge hazmat suits on.
Oh, wow. As if it's like airborne.
Exactly, and that's where he dies. And, in the service I'm talking about at St Mary's, we had 3 of those wards. So we had 90 beds. We didn't use hazmat suits. We'd gone beyond that. We'd got the education. And part of my job was to educate the staff about how best to interact with people. But we would have 90 essentially young gay men and a few injecting drug users who were just dying. And the trauma around that, it was often families wouldn't accept the whole situation that they had a son in that position. If they did, they would call it cancer, not AIDS, because cancer was more acceptable. You had partners and friends completely disowned, not allowed to go to funerals, bodies being taken away and buried elsewhere in the country in secret. It was awful. And a bit like happened in Australia, there was a big government-run publicity campaign to try and enable the community to understand the impact, but it was all done in doom and gloom. And again, the impact of that on the people directly affected was, again, more traumatic. But it also created a huge amount of energy certainly within the gay community, and things happened and things got created. And I think today we've got a lot to be incredibly thankful for in terms of the gay community's response to HIV and AIDS back in the 80s. So, for example, at the time, cancer was really never, it was better to die of cancer than AIDS, but cancer wasn't talked about. It was always the big C.
Yeah.
And the fact that we now talk about people living with cancer, that whole notion of putting the person first came out of HIV and AIDS, because we insisted. We started talking about people living with HIV, not dying from AIDS.
Yep.
And the pressure the community put on the drug sector, the pharmaceutical sector, to open up and be more transparent about the development of drugs and get them out to test sooner. And that's what we saw in the response to COVID.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I just don't think those things would have happened
if it
hadn't been that experience.
Well, sometimes you got to go through the hells to get the learnings, right? The silver lining is it was able to save many lives thereafter.
Yeah. So, and then there were great other, I was very much involved with a thing called the London Lighthouse, which was a palliative care centre set up specifically for people with HIV and AIDS, created by some great people. I was very fortunate and privileged to be on the board of that for a little while. That was something that Princess Diana was patron of. Yep. She did amazing. I'm not a royalist, but I have to say I have a special place in my heart for Princess Diana. I was fortunate to meet her a number of times, but her commitment to the AIDS activity and to the gay community just was stunning. And was completely out of step with the rest of the traditional system at the time.
How did you go about meeting her?
Just because of being on the board of Lighthouse. She would come into Lighthouse completely outside of any publicity. She would just come in of an evening and just sit with somebody.
Yeah, great.
And sit at their bedside and chat to them.
Yeah.
So there was no pomp and ceremony. There was nothing. It wasn't about getting publicity. It was just how she thought she should be doing
Someone
things.
who used her
cared.
images. Yeah, and actually used it for good, which is great. Tragic story in its own right. So tell us about then your career and your evolution. I think I remember you saying that early in your career you helped, you worked in a place called Brighton, helping people with disability, and now today you find yourself working in a place called Brighton in Adelaide, helping people with disability. Let's talk about your career, and I do know that you were one of the youngest CEOs at the time in the health network within the UK, and I'd be really interested to hear your career progression and journey.
Yeah, so I was at university at Sussex University, which is on the outskirts of Brighton. I'd had that little bit of experience of nursing prior to getting into university because I thought I was going to go and do nursing. So when I was at university, it was a time when university education was free, and I got a grant, and I think it was £200 a term for subsistence. But it clearly wasn't enough, and so I had to do some work. And so I went to, and there was again a reluctance to accept men at the time. This was 1980 into agency nursing or nursing assistance, because I wasn't a nurse, but I had a bit of experience. And so couldn't get any work from that. And so I thought about looking at social care, and went to the social services department of Brighton Council and said, look, I've got these skills. I would really like some part-time work. You use agency. Can we cut that out? And can you just employ me? And they said, oh, we've never done that before. But I said, you could set up your own casual pool. You don't need to use agency, and then you cut out some cost. Oh, that's a good idea. And so that's what they did, and they employed me as the first one in that pool.
Yeah, very good.
And I was working with people with intellectual disability in a hostel. It was like a respite hostel for people with intellectual disability. So for the 3 years that I was at university, I was getting my paid work and supplementary income by working with people with intellectual disability. And so that's the then full circle, 40 odd years later, being back in a place called Brighton with people with intellectual disability. So that was my first real experience of prolonged experience around care. I've already described what happened when I did my PhD, and then I ended up in the health system. And for me, and I think it goes back to the very beginning, what I was saying about my dad and my values. My focus has always and continues to be the people that myself, the organisation, is there to support. I'm not there for me. I'm not there for boards to make money. I'm not there for for that. I'm there for the actual people who need the support.
Yeah.
And believe
Which is why
in
you've
that.
always worked for purpose-led businesses, right?
And I like to have that direct connection. So when I got into that world of HIV and AIDS, that was very much what I brought with me, and had that direct connection with people with HIV, people on the streets, doing it tough, and then thinking, well, how do we now create a service that actually is going to best meet their needs?
Yep.
And as I'd got a growing reputation for doing that, because as I said, I am an activist in a sense. So one of the other things I did, so I was the first person appointed into a role like that in the NHS. But it spread quickly, and within a year there was over 100 of us. And I then was instrumental in creating a thing called the HIV Workers Alliance. So we started to get a bit of professionalism and consistency about how we could work together and learn from each other. So I was getting a reputation for being able to bring things together, design services, and Thatcher comes into play again because she brought in reforms into the National Health Service and decided it should be split into two components, the bit that provided the services and the bit that commissioned services. And so I was asked then to move into that space of being a commissioner of health services. So I went to work for the health authority in the middle of London. It was the one responsible for St Mary's, but was to set up, and again, be part of the pilot to set up that commissioning role. And that was, I think, in recognition of my experience around how to take an understanding of what people were looking for and needed, and then how do you design a service. And today, a lot of that gets called co-design. I think it was just my natural practice sort of 40 years ago.
To seek others' perspectives.
That's right. And then look at how you enable nurses, doctors, other professionals to respond to that and create a service environment that's going to give you, both as an organisation and as an individual person or patient, the best outcome possible. And so had that experience of developing that commissioning role, then moved into East London as Deputy Chief Executive of the East London Health Service, doing that commissioning role, but also then getting into bigger enterprises around redesigning the structures. So one of the things I did there and again, it's important for people to understand that health in the UK at the time was very different to the public hospital system here in Australia and the politics around it. Because the NHS is so big, the Secretary of State for Health at a national government level doesn't get involved in the day-to-day running because they can't. And so if you're running that health service, you are the face of that health service to the local public and all the local stakeholders, including the local MPs. And so as part of the changes that we put in place in East London was to close the emergency department of St Bart's Hospital in the City of London, which had been there for 800 years. And was
How was that dealt with?
Well, it was well loved by the people in the City of London.
You can imagine.
But the City of London has very little residential population. And the borough of Tower Hamlets next door is one of the poorest in the UK, and equally had a hospital that was built in the 1700s that was falling over. And we needed to do something different. And we needed to move the service and rebuild the one in Tower Hamlets. So I led the process of closing down the emergency department. Some of the community response to that was then that A1 size black and white portrait posters of me went up all over the city saying, this man is trying to close this bureaucrat is trying to close your hospital.
How did you manage that?
Well, but it's just, you had to do the public meetings. I've stood on platforms and argued as to why we're making this. I've had things thrown at me.
So did you ever feel threatened?
But again, I think it goes back to that. My basic sort of resilience and personality is, well, I believe this is right. I've got the evidence that it's the right thing to do. And so we'll push on and then see what happens. And with those things, again, we're not They all then end up going through a formal process. If
Yep.
there is a significant degree of concern from the community, it will eventually escalate up to the Secretary of State for a decision,
Yep.
as that one did, and he agreed with the decision we were making.
So I guess that's a question around that. If you went out to these days we call it stakeholder engagement,
Yep.
or community stakeholder engagement. If you went out to the community and you said, this is what we're planning on doing, you probably would have got a lot of no way in hell that's happening.
Yep.
But yet you were adamant, based on your research and data, that this was the right decision, and the opportunities that you were putting forward were greater than what
Yep.
was. How did you come to managing that? That's a big change piece right there. How did you come to about managing that in a successful way towards the end, where people started getting on board and supporting what you were doing?
So for me, it's about, with any change process, it is communication. It's about being transparent in the communication, being honest and upfront, because I think as soon as you try to pull the wool over somebody's eyes, then that undermines everything that you've built up.
Absolutely.
And it's then making sure that those people who, in some of those more traditional systems and processes, don't have a voice, how do you enable them to have a voice? Not to speak for them, because again, that is, I think, fraught with difficulty. It's enabling those people to have a voice for themselves. Yeah. And so enabling the people of Tower Hamlets to have a voice, to say, actually, we need this, is then eventually gets momentum to have as a bigger sway than essentially the articulate white middle class group who were trying to defend what had always been in place and didn't want to see any change. So for me, it's just that process of having to try and build a sense of belief and enabling those other voices to come through. Yeah. Because I do believe most of us at the end of the day will listen and will put aside our own prejudices given that opportunity.
Yeah, correct. I guess like in the world of change, which is a space in which I play in a lot with the business that I run in SynergyIQ, the asking of the question is where we would say, this is what we're going to do. We're going to go out and consult first. And the pushback that you would have got early, how did you make the decision that no, we're going to do this first before we go out and seek advice or share it with the community? Because great change management is getting people involved early, taking in their input, and then utilising their perspectives and building a scenario which works for all. Yep. In this case, where it's health and it's a different scenario, sometimes you can't do what the people want because we've got to save some lives here as well, especially in the case of emergency departments. Yep. How did you manage that scenario? So
again, I think you've got to have a very good map, if you like, of what the various stakeholders are and the levels of the process you need to go through. So again, I don't want to give people a sense that I'm some sort of maverick that just goes off and does this. No. As somebody I was at that stage sort of deputy chief exec of the East London and City Health Authority. I reported to a chief exec and a board that was appointed by the Secretary of State for Health, and there was a chair to that board, and they were the ones who actually needed to make decisions. My job was to feed them with the information to be able to make what hopefully was the right decision. And so in this particular process, they're the ones who have to be convinced, if you like, by the initial business case that closing the ED at St Bartholomew's and looking to rebuild the Royal London Hospital in Tower Hamlets, combining the resources of the two hospitals was the right thing to do. The right decision, yeah. And so that's then needing to have that sort of academic evidence base. And so a needs assessment of what were the health dynamics of those populations, what were then the services that they might need. So there's a lot of data behind it. So all that work behind it. So you knew that the decision that you're making was the right one. And that's part of my academic skill set, I think, is I'm good at handling. I am not a detail person. I'm very clear. I hate detail. I'm very good at big picture. I'm very good at sort of reading data and complex policy documents quite quickly, and putting them together in a way which enables other people who are less good at that to grasp quickly what it all means.
Absolutely.
And I think that's one of my key skill sets.
That was your key skill set, right? Was being able to collate that data. Is that something that has really held you in good stead? The learnings that you had in that early phase of making that large change? No doubt, and we'll hear more of it as we continue through your career journey. You've been kind of the person that's been called in to come in and fix things, right? And help transform. Do you feel like that early learning of the way in which you managed that project held you in good stead for the rest of your career?
Absolutely. I mean, and again, I think I just feel incredibly privileged that I've managed to be in particular places at particular times that have enabled me to learn and grow. And I think also part of, I would go back to the gay thing in that because of, and it's very different now, but because of what it was like then, I had very little expectation of the thought of having a family and having children. And so in terms of thinking about my career, I think I had great flexibility because I didn't have to think about, I've got to get the next job to get the increase in pay, to be able to afford to have the kids, to be able to do X, Y, and Z. I could take far more risk and pick the jobs that I was interested in and do them because I was really interested in them rather than because I thought I had to.
Yeah.
And so
you didn't have anyone else to provide for.
That's right. And that, it's when I look at many of my colleagues from the time, and many who've gone on to do some really great things. Somebody who I was very good friends with ended up running the whole of the NHS until a few years ago. I just never saw myself as wanting that sort of trajectory. I just wanted to be able to have interesting jobs that kept me alive and passionate, not doing something because I thought it was the next thing I had to do in my career. And so that has given me greater flexibility to try and get myself into that interesting place at that interesting time to be doing something new and something different. Because I certainly know, in the same way that I know I'm not a detailed operational person, I'm equally not a maintenance person. The last thing I really want to do is just see something tick over.
Yeah. Actually, you're the second CEO that said that to me recently, which is around, my game is to come in and help transform and change. When it's steady sailing, I get a little bit bored. I want to go off and help someone else, right? Use my skill set. So you became, at that point, we're talking in the story, you were the acting chief, and then you obviously then went on to become a chief executive. What was that learning like? You in our conversation, you said I was one of the youngest chief executives at the time. How did you, in amongst all this, learn and develop yourself? Like, did you put time and effort into it? Did you say, actually, I want to lead this company, I want to lead this department, I want to lead, you ended up at Brighton Local Council as well, which was responsible of, I think, how many, sort of 300,000 people or something. That's like right, that? Yeah. 20,000 staff in there, in amongst that as well. Was that the trajectory in which you saw your career going? It's actually, I'm going to lead, and what do I need to do as a leader and manage my own behaviour and my own knowledge and everything else that goes with it?
No. And again, I'm a very bad role model in the sense that I did attend a 3-week general management training program in 1987, I think it was, at the King's Fund Institute, and it was a great program. But that's the only formal bit of management change training I've ever had. Everything else has been on the job. And really learning from those that I respect around me. And
it's the best way, isn't it?
Yeah, exactly. And I've just got, I wouldn't have done what I've done without some amazing people, and I have to say particularly some amazing women. Dr. Leela Lessoff, who appointed me to that first job, in Islington around HIV, Dr. Sheila Adam, who then appointed me to this big service job. Barbara Young, now Baroness Barbara Young in the House of Lords in the UK, who was the chief exec of that health authority, going down the commissioning role that gave me the opportunity.
Yep.
You know, and it was the same in going to my first chief exec job, and I think I was 31, in Hillingdon in West London. And for those of you who don't know Hillingdon, it's where Heathrow Airport is. So
Yep.
I also took on responsibility for all of the health around Heathrow and immigration and all that sort of stuff as part of that. And Sandra Edwards, who is the chair who appointed me there, you know, I went through phases where I thought I needed to conform in order to get the progress.
Mm-hmm.
And so I did want to be a chief exec. And so I remember going to the interview. I wore a suit and tie, as you'd expect, but I took my earrings out.
Okay.
Yeah, and I've had earrings since I was 15 or 16.
Yeah.
And after the interview, Sandra rang me up and said, interviewed really well. We really love you to come and be our chief exec. And she said, and I think you can put the earrings back.
Okay. So she knows.
Because she knew, because I had a profile that I wore earrings.
Yeah.
You know, and it's sort of and so it's little learnings like that, but then being given the opportunity to undertake some of those bigger changes.
Yeah.
And, you know, Hillingdon was great because it was my first chief exec job, but it was in a time of a lot of change. And through that, I got to work with the Blair government on the modernisation of the NHS when the Blair government first came in towards the end of the 90s, and set up the country's one of the first primary care trusts, which was the new model in which services were going to be delivered with GPs running things.
Yep.
So I had over about 350 individual GPs who are part of the NHS but are also privately run, trying to coalesce and bring them together to work in this sort of co-design way and think about. It was, again, just an amazing opportunity.
Yeah. When you walk into a role as CEO, do you go in with the knowledge of what needs to be transformed straight away, and then do you get that sort of gut feel looking from the outside in, or does it take time for you to learn and understand and being able to pivot and shift?
I think it's a mixture, because if you know, with the current role at Minda, for example, you know, it's been very difficult to live within the South Australian environment in recent years without seeing, you know, the headlines in the Advertiser about what's happened at Minda over recent years. And so, absolutely, I went into the interviews for that process with a very clear view, a pitch as to what I thought needed to happen in order to bring Minda good. And if and I was very frank with the board that this is what I think. I need to check this out, but these are certainly the types of things we need to be doing. If you're up for that, then I'm very happy, you know, if you ask me to accept the job. But if you don't believe that's the right thing, then equally, I don't feel I'll walk away. It's not a.
Were you right in the most part for that?
Oh, I think. Well,
what work? How you were able to disclose what those were? Those things that you said.
Well, it's in line with what I've already indicated elsewhere in my life. It's sort of, I think Minda had lost its focus on why it was there and who it was there for. We're there for people with intellectual disability and to enable them to have the best lives. And as an organisation, we diversified into a whole range of things which weren't necessarily the core business and therefore became a distraction. And so the last couple of years has been rebuilding back that core purpose, and that starts with actually talking and listening to the people that we're there for, people with intellectual disability, and why they didn't like what Minda was offering them. And then how do we change what Minda offers so that it's more consistent with what they and their families or support networks are looking for. So it's, again, I don't think it's rocket science.
No, but it is interesting because, you know, I started my own business, right? This is the business that I started and co-founded and run. And when you first start off, it's kind of, let's grab whatever we can, you know, we'll do whatever we have to do to survive, right? And then as you grow older, you start realizing actually being connected to the core purpose and having that niche is far more valuable to the community in which you serve than trying to do everything for that community. So something that we've learned over time, especially with my own business. It seems to me, though, that you are, and throughout your whole career, and the word purpose has come up a couple of times, that you are connected to purpose. Therefore, it's very easy for you to look in and see, hang on, we're clearly not living to what our values are, to what our purpose is. We've diversified way too much here. Hence the reason why we're in a bit of trouble, because we're actually now not serving in a way in which we're good at. Would you say that's a common thing amongst many businesses? And further to that, how do you stop thinking about the brand new shiny ball and the opportunity for the cash grab with these things and stick to your purpose? Do you know what I mean? So there's a bit of tempt that comes into that as well.
Well, but I think that probably is a key issue in terms of what is an organisation there for, and is growth the only factor that you're in pursuit of? And it's why I do have significant concerns, for example, about the way in which we have swallowed hook, line and sinker, that for the not-for-profit or mission-based sector, we're importing a corporate governance model. Because I don't think that the corporate governance model is necessarily right. Now, I'm not suggesting we don't want good practice, but what I've seen in other not-for-profit organisations is you have a more corporate-style board that is completely focused on the bottom line and potentially will reduce the types of services they're doing, particularly in an environment where the government are commissioning or procuring services. They'll focus on where they think they can get the best return. Whereas in reality, in my mind, for not-for-profit is a not-for-profit. Yes, we need to make enough profit to cover our costs and to do good, but we're not looking to be, mega cash rich, in my view. Some will disagree with that. And so I think that's part of the challenge, is what is right. You mentioned earlier on about how I sort of learn or how I've developed. And I also, in addition to just learning from the good people around me, there's been occasions when I've decided I need to understand something better, and will then try and work out a way of doing that. And when I was in that first job in Hillingdon, was really concerned about how much of the health budget was clearly being spent on pharmaceuticals. And so I wanted to understand how the pharmaceutical business worked. And we had a big multinational pharmaceutical company actually in the area in terms of their headquarters. And I managed to get myself a 6-month sort of part-time secondment to them, just to be able to get a sense of how their world operated. And
so you put yourself in the situation.
Absolutely. And what it brought home to me, though, is that company that made billions literally had about 12, 13 key products. And that was it entirely. And yes, they did lots of research, and they had some very fancy research setups to try and find new products. But their whole business actually existed internationally on about 12 or 13 particular drugs. And so I also came away from that experience not just knowing a bit more about the drug world, or the pharmaceutical world, but it was also it took out of me any notion that I wanted to work in the private sector. Because I actually just found it quite boring. It was like, well, is this all you're doing?
Correct. It was rinse repeat almost, and
whereas
stick with what you do. And
in health and social care, where you're dealing with people with huge diversity of need, a whole age spectrum. There's never a day that's necessarily the same.
But on that, I mean, you said you don't believe that non-for-profit needs to be cash rich. There's this perspective that the more cash you have, the more good that you can do, right? In the sense that the more, in the world of Minda, the more people with disability you can help.
No, absolutely. I think that I'm not opposed to fundraising. What I am opposed to is focusing your core purpose on those things which are profitable.
Yeah.
And that is one of the big issues at the moment with the NDIS, and that's part of why the government are sort of clamping down on the degree of fraud, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah. There's a lot of that going on.
Yeah, so I just think I'm just really mindful of the fact that, say, the corporate governance model isn't necessarily the right model for many not-for-profits and mission-based organisations, because I've seen it happen where that board is following all of its fiduciary responsibilities, etc., but by default they actually miss why they were created in the first place.
Correct. Yeah, which is ultimately we're here to serve, right? So we've kind of skipped in your career, but while we're talking about Minda, how bad was it when you walked in?
I mean, I think it was very challenged financially. As I say, they'd made a lot of decisions which had used up the capital that it did have and reserves that it did have. But it also, more fundamentally, hadn't really got to grips with the world of NDIS and how that was different from being an organisation that just got a single big block contract and was free to do what it felt was right to do.
Yep.
Because with NDS, and I absolutely support this model, it's for the individual clients, consumers, participants, whatever we want to call them, the people living with the intellectual disability themselves, get the money, and then they choose who they want to spend that money with and what their expectations are from that. And so it was in my view, that it was that dual element of pursuing a strategy to survive that was based on diversification rather than on the core business, and then by default neglecting the core business and not really having the dialogue, the engagement with people that we were directly there to support.
Yeah. And was that the key reason in which you took on the job and wanted to go? Because you left from ECH to go to Minda. Was it actually, this is exciting and I can turn this around and bring it back to purpose?
Yeah, I mean, I've been very open and honest with people. I mean, I'd always assumed that the role at ECH would be my last full-time chief exec job.
Yep.
And I'd done sort of just over 7 years. We'd done the transformation that ECH had wanted away from residential aged care to focus on housing and on home care and enabling older people to live at home until death and to have a good and respectful death at home. We'd made a lot of change in that space. We were getting into that maintenance mode. And so, and again, I think I do feel quite strongly that you need to refresh the leadership at chief exec level. I don't, and ECH was a good example where the founding chief exec had been there for over 30 years. My predecessor had been there for over 20. Yeah. There was no way that I was going to be there that long. No. And so again, after 7 years, it began to felt that it was important for them just to have a refresh and to think differently. And it just so happened that my thoughts around that coincided with the Minda job coming up. Yep. Had a long discussion with Desmond, my partner, about what should we do? What should I do about this? And decided, because of my strength of feeling about an organisation like Minda should be doing a better job. And Minda provides support to some of the most severely disadvantaged individuals with intellectual disability, and with a high degree of complexity. And if Minda doesn't exist, what's going to happen to all those people? Because I don't think there's necessarily other organisations with the same depth of experience that could pick that up. So I felt that it was an appropriate challenge. Yeah. But as I said earlier, I was very clear going into that process, had a long conversation with the chair of Minda before applying to make sure that got a sense of whether we'd be on the same page, which we were, put in my application, went through the interview process, really pleased Minda that included a second phase where I actually got sort of interviewed by family members.
Yep.
So they could check me out as well.
Yep.
So it felt a very thorough process.
Yep.
And so, I sort of committed to potentially 5 years to Minda to be able to oversee this sort of transformation.
And you're 3 years in?
2 years in.
2 years in? That's right, you're looking at the new strategy. So your first strategy was to get you out of the debt that you were in.
That's right, yeah. So it's very much a recovery strategy. And that was initially a 3-year strategy. But at the moment, we're on schedule to achieve most of the objectives of that by the end of this financial year. So 2 financial years rather than 3. So the board is now working on the strategy that will come into place for FY25 that then begins to focus on sustainability and growth within that context.
So 26 million in debt, is that where it got to at some point? Is that the numbers?
And so we in terms of line of credit arrangements and being fully utilised with the bank, yes, it was that sort of order.
So how do you turn something like that around? I mean, obviously we've said you went back to purpose, and I do believe there was an announcement recently with yourselves and the Bedford Group.
No, that's right. Yep, that's because we have been a provider of supported employment programs and a number of businesses like the electronic recycling service and a variety of other things. And again, the board's come to a view that that's not our core business, and it is Bedford's. And so if we can organise, which we're hopefully in the middle of doing now, a successful transfer of those businesses to Bedford, that will enable them to grow and develop and enable us to, as part of our refocusing on our core business of supporting people to live independently.
Yeah, great.
So
you've been doing that with Myron. He's been on the show. He's a great human being, Myron Mann, the CEO of Bedford Group.
It's been very good working with Myron. There's the work going on to look at the core purpose, but a lot of the financial issues we've had to grapple with have also been about basic processes. The NDIS at its core is a good system in that you have to make claims for the services you provide for an individual, but they pay within 3 days. And a lot of the basic systems at Minda just didn't. And I think when I arrived, we were something like 12, 13 million in arrears for actually claiming payments that were due to us. And so a lot of the work over the last 2 years has also been putting in place some of those basic systems. And again, getting a streamlining of the systems within the organisations. So to get those invoices to NDIS signed off went through multiple hands in different physical locations. So one of the first things that I did there was create what we now call the Client Services Unit, which has brought all of those people together into a single team.
Well done.
In the same building.
Makes sense.
And they then are also the front face of Minda with all the clients that we have. So if you're a client or a family member of a client and you've got a problem, that's who you go to. And then you hopefully can get a single answer of anything to do with the services being provided to you. Whereas previously you had to go to half a dozen different places. But that meant also in the back office, it was half a dozen places trying to pull together data to be able to submit an invoice.
Okay.
So just some very basic process stuff.
Minda was in the paper quite a bit there for a period, and it wasn't all good that was written about him, which naturally is going to have an impact on your workforce, right? And the engagement of your workforce and the ability to retain and attract new people to working for you. How did you manage that situation? And culturally, how did you manage that in trying to shift and turn the boat around? So again, I think my starting point is that in any organisation I've worked in, 95% of the people who work there want to work there, have the right intent, and want to be able to do the right thing. And if they're not able to do the right thing, it's more than likely because we as an organisation have put a barrier in their way to doing that.
And so we've got to own up to that, and we've got to have that engagement with staff and listen to their perspective. And in some ways, again, it's sort of the using your own experience. So this is a ECH example where we did a lot of work in the technology space. And I am somebody who, despite my interest in innovation, at a personal level, don't engage with a lot of technology. Obviously, I've got a phone and a computer, but I'm not somebody who is particularly an avid follower of all of that. And at ECH, we brought in, as part of streamlining, a methodology, an app for dealing with corporate credit cards. And I use that now as a story to staff to say, look, change affects all of us, and sometimes we've actually just got to get on with it. And so I was the one who was the most recalcitrant of using the app, because in my old world, I just brought in my credit card receipt, the invoices and receipts, and just handed them all to the wonderful Margaret, who was my EA, and she just dealt with it. With the app, I had to take photos, I had to do stuff at the time, which was just a pain. It took up more of my time. Why did I want to do that? But I then realised, well, actually, no, I have to do this. And if I don't do it, why is the rest of the organisation going to do it?
Correct.
And so I think that for me, the engagement of staff is about creating an ability to engage with them in a meaningful way. And so, again, for me, that is at a personal level. So I spend a lot of time out and about in services, being visible. I don't have any pomp and ceremony. One of the first things I did in creating the new exec team at Minda is put us all in an open plan office, because I believe it enhances our ability to work together, but it's also a visible sign to the rest of the organisation about how we work together, and that we're no different to anybody else, because our other back office staff work in open offices, so why should the exec be any different? And also giving a guarantee to staff. And I do things like roadshows when we launched the recovery strategy, went on a roadshow to talk to all staff in all our locations about what that was about and what it meant for them, and giving people a guarantee that if they email me, I will respond within 24 hours. Great. And it may be that, I need more time, but I'll come back and say that I need more time to think about that. Because I want them to come back to me with their concerns, also what they've spotted as a barrier, what they've spotted as an opportunity to improve what we do to support somebody with intellectual disability. They've got far more ideas.
Correct.
Again, I constantly say, absolutely. I have 100 ideas every day. But thankfully, I've got enough sense to have a team around me who say to 99.5 of those, David, you think it's a good idea. It's actually a pile of crap. Forget it.
I'm reminded of the same thing every day. Just on that, so that brings up the role of a CEO. I mean, what have you learned about your role, about the role of a CEO over the years, and just the role of leadership in general? Obviously, you came to, when did you come to Australia?
20 years ago, 2004.
2004. So 2004, you came here and you walked into roles, in CEO roles of Central Northern Health Network, Local Health Network, then Central Adelaide Health Network, and then in TCH, and all being CEO roles. And obviously the Carlin role, the Central Adelaide Health Network, you were responsible of managing the big new Royal Adelaide, the $1.83 billion project there. So that was a huge piece of work. What have you, looking back at your career, and I think you've said to me previously that Minda is your last CEO role, and the same as you said with ECH. Looking back at your career, what have you learnt from your leadership journey more that sticks in your mind more than anything else?
I think it is, I'm trying not to use the trendy words, but I think for me, it's about being real. So I'm trying to avoid the word authentic because I think it's overplayed. But I think it's about being real and not putting yourself into the other category because of how you perceive your status. And well, I'm the chief exec. I'm just so fundamentally opposed to that perspective, because I think that, and I will often in organizations, I've done this throughout my career, is I present organizational structure diagrams upside down to the traditional way. So I will put the chief exec at the bottom because my job is to support the rest of the organization.
Yeah, I like that.
And yes, again, the thing I share a lot with people that I've mentored, I don't believe that we even should be necessarily talking about leadership. It's followership.
Yeah.
You can't be a leader unless people are willing to follow. And people, in my experience, won't follow if they don't have confidence. And therefore, a lot of the anxiety in my role is, because again, I think if a chief exec gets too cocky, if they think they know it, then the distance between them and those following is getting too big.
Yeah.
And so you need to be enough ahead in order to give people confidence that you know where we're going.
Yeah. Yeah. Absolutely.
Without actually knowing where we're going.
Yeah, I mean, and that was going to be
that sort of that was the anxiety for me. That's always the area for me. And if I feel too comfortable, then it's not in the right space.
And that was going to be my question, because when you say real, / authentic, if I look at myself, my real authentic self is, I don't actually know. Like, I'm figuring this out as we go along. How much can you say that to people, right? Especially if you're looking for followership. If you're not clear and concise and you're figuring this out as you go along, which I think most people are. I've spoken to a lot of CEOs, and many of them are like, you make your mistakes, and you're going to continue to make mistakes. How do you sort of mold that together in what's real, but what is actually needed for quality leadership, direction, whatever you call that?
I think it is for me, it goes back to what I was saying earlier on, that it's having that sense of being slightly ahead. But for that to work, you've got to have those good communication and feedback processes and engagement with staff.
Yeah.
Because they feed off each other in a way. So, and I think it's probably got more so as I've got older, to be frank. My work persona and my personal life persona are very different. And I am one of those, I would now very happily describe myself as, at work, I'm an extrovert. I've got no problem in standing up in front of thousands of people or half a dozen people and leading a process or whatever. But it's something I hate doing in my private life. And, even to the point when it was my 60th birthday a couple of years ago, and was persuaded to have the party, which didn't really want to have, and knew I was going to have to do some sort of speech. My only way of handling that was to do a PowerPoint presentation, which was all photographs. But it was really just saying, look, I've got a wonderful 100 people here in the room with me, but the reality is none of you have known me for more than a third of my life. And had this event been back in the UK, there would have been a lot of other people there as well. And so I want to share with you all those other people that would have been here. And that also then enabled me to pay my respect to some of those people I mentioned earlier on, because they were in some of the photographs, and they're still friends, who were just so great to me in past lives. So I'm very aware that I have a work persona, which is extrovert, but is also that, again, I've said it several times, not standing on ceremony. I am not driven by status. I think I probably made the decision 10, 15, probably 10 or 12 years ago, that part of me being real was dressing as I would dress. Now, I said earlier on about the earrings. They've always been there. But, I would often wear a suit to work. I don't have a suit in my wardrobe now because it's not something I feel comfortable in.
You look great the way you are.
But it's how I want our staff to feel. That they don't have to wear a particular form of dress that's irrelevant.
Yeah.
I'm more interested in how they're actually doing the job and what sort of person they are.
And I think just while we're on the subject of leadership and and being a CE, I guess in this instance, you're walking into a role 2 years ago and all the other roles there before, which is so important for the people, especially particularly here in South Australia. And I'm not discounting anything you did back in the UK. I'm just talking about South Australia now. It's so important. Like the Minda Corporation right now is so important for South Australia. The new Royal Adelaide Hospital was so important for South Australia. The aged care world, we're all getting old, right? And we're all going to end up in that world at some point. It's so important. When you walk in, and especially in the case of Minda, of where it was to where you're trying to take it, do you ever doubt yourself? Is there any sort of fear? And you said the word anxiety before. Do you ever think, shit, if I stuff this up, like I'm actually probably going to potentially could do more detrimental?
No, absolutely. And I think that, that's that issue about also being very aware of the mistakes of the past that you've made and a learning from that also potentially gives some perspective. So again, if I take the example of when I spent a number of years as the chief exec of Brighton Hove City Council. Mm-hmm. So a bizarre role in a way because it's local government in the UK is very different to here in Australia because it's more like state government. You run everything. And it was a population of 300,000. Very few people end up in those jobs who haven't grown up in local government. Yeah. I had a reputation commented on in the national professional press in the UK of being, I got labelled a boundroid, that I always worked on the edge of systems. So in health, I was interested in that interface between GPs and hospitals. And then I got interested in the way in which health and social care work together. Yeah. And so for me, moving to local government, particularly Brighton, given my historic affiliation with that place, being at university there, it was just a great opportunity. Yep. But some awful things happened there, which were genuinely tragic, which I had to take responsibility for, but were outside of my control.
Can you
yes. So we ran child protection services. We had the awful death of a baby that should never have happened. Now that happened, X number of layers away from me, but I'm the chief exec. Yeah. So I have to take responsibility. Yeah. I have to apologise. I have to appear in court. Going back to the health days when they introduced care in the community. And so that meant closing down the institutions, which I also got the pleasure of doing here with Glenside when I arrived. But I closed down something similar to Glenside in the early 90s when I was in East London. And one of the ramifications of care in the community is that some people with mental health issues did unfortunately do some tragic things. And there was one particular one where somebody pushed somebody under a tube train. Yeah, wow. And again, that ended up as a coronial and then an inquiry. I had to front the health services as to what we had done to enable that person with mental health issues to be in that place at that time. Those are far more, to me, important consequences of what I have or haven't done that I've had to get to grips with emotionally. And so when there are the sort of tough times, I reflect back on those, not necessarily organisational type issues, because the consequence of those is, in many cases, not that great necessarily.
Yeah. It's the consequence on the individual.
And so that, bringing it back to now and Minda, that's why our entire focus is now around, okay, having got back to that core business, how do we really make sure that our staff on the ground, day in, day out, are actually doing what they need to do to enable somebody with intellectual disability to have their best life. and how do we make sure that they've got the appropriate training, they've got the experience, they're being supported to do those things, because those are the things that are actually going to make a real difference in terms of outcomes for those individuals and their families.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. Another conversation, which I think it just ties into what you said then about especially supporting those with disabilities for a better life. And you said this to me on the phone the other day, which was around the aged care space, but kind of ties into the disability sector as well, which was there's this sense of guilt when you send your relatives to aged care, and then the same might be the same from a disability point of view as well. Hey, can you elaborate on your thoughts? Because I know this is a really passion point for you.
Yeah. So it probably reflects, again, my sort of psychology background and how I view the world. So I certainly think that one of the issues that doesn't get addressed in policy sufficiently is the role of guilt in decision-making around services, particularly aged care and now disability, because, and I think what I observed in aged care was that it's the children wanting to get the best possible for their mum or their dad, and wanting to, and acknowledging that their lives are such, because may have kids of their own, they've got working lives, so their ability to give their mum or their dad that best life is hampered. Yeah. And so but they want to make sure it happens. And so they then have expectations of the service that's doing that for, instead of them. And that they'll also then potentially, and we saw this time and time again, think the best solution is therefore residential aged care. Mm-hmm. When in fact that older person could actually stay living at the home much longer. Mm. But there's that anxiety about they're not safe, and if I'm not there and they fell over or something happened, that would be awful, etc., etc. Whereas in reality, accidents happen, people do fall over, and we all die of something in the end. And in my experience at Minda, it's the reverse of that. It's the issues around parents, or if parents have died and the mantle has been passed to siblings of the person with intellectual disability, they want that person to have that best life, and they want to make sure they're safe. And in doing that, though, it may actually limit the risks that person's allowed to take. Mm. And therefore, they don't necessarily get the best life.
Or experiences.
And so how do we then work with people with that guilt to enable them to reflect on that, to think differently, so that the individual concerned, the person with intellectual, can actually take some risks. They can go out, they can do things. They actually might. And we've had some wonderful examples where, thinking of somebody who has lived in a larger group setting, which was too institutional at Minda, where pre-prepared meals were being brought in, et cetera, every day. And we made the decision for a number of those 4 individuals to move out of that setting into a house in the community. Yeah. And a lot of anxiety from family and from staff about, they won't be able to cope, they can't do. Yeah. But actually, it's been amazing. And those people, their staff now work with those people to go to the shops to get the food, to then help them prepare the meals, so they're not pre-prepared being brought in. Yeah. And as a consequence, one of those people has now started feeding themselves. When we were told they've never fed themselves, they've had to be fed, they're now feeding themselves. Yeah. Now, that's a small gain. It's really important for that person.
Absolutely.
That suddenly they feel able to feed themselves. Yeah. Whereas
and not relying on.
Yeah, exactly. So it's sort of it's that sort of micro stuff.
This is a child parent thing, same sort of thing. You got to let your child fall over and scrape their knee to know not to do it again, right? And they have to. That's how they learn. This is the same sort of scenario. I am conscious of your time. We are flown through. It's been talking for an hour and a half or now, but I guess one thing that I do want to really talk on before we jump into some quick fire questions is, what do you think the challenges from the healthcare sector, aged care sector, disability sector, what are you concerned about more so than anything else looking forward 10, 20 years' time?
I think probably consistent with some of what I've articulated already, I have a view that we need to develop those systems so that people are seen holistically. We've been great as a society, both here and in the UK, of carving people up. So you have a health issue, you've got a disability, you're aged or whatever. We don't look holistically at what that person actually needs. And some of the most innovative developments happening within health and social care elsewhere in the world, and indeed in particular in some of the Scandinavian countries, is where they've made that step to look holistically at what somebody needs and then design the system and the services around them. We have, there's always going to be an issue about whether there's enough tax dollars to pay for all the services, and we're seeing that in NDIS at the moment. That's always going to be an issue. No matter what the taxation rates are, there's potentially never going to be enough to meet all the needs. But I'm absolutely convinced we waste so much of the tax dollar because we have these discrete systems that you've got to jump across, and therefore we miss people and they deteriorate because of those gaps in the system. And some of those learnings from elsewhere, and it's one of the things I've been quite critical of publicly in the professional world within Australia, is that I've found in my 20 years in Australia is very bad at looking beyond its borders, what's happening elsewhere and what can we do.
It's very isolated.
And for me, innovation in health and social care is largely around looking what's working elsewhere and doing it here. It's not thinking completely blue sky and doing something completely radical. It's just taking something that works somewhere else. Can we make it work here if it's going to be better for people?
Absolutely.
So that for me is what, it's the how you bring those different worlds together.
What does that look like? What is looking holistic at those three worlds in particular?
Well, so what would happen is you might, let's make it very real. You might say, let's look at the population of Mount Gambier. Look at what their needs are, that needs assessment work, getting a sense of what does that population profile look like, etc. And then in aged care, health and disability, let's just work on those three. Take all the public money that's spent in those three domains on that population of 25, 30,000 people and put it all in one pot and give one body the responsibility to say, okay, you've got that pot of money, now actually spend that on services for that community that's focused on getting better outcomes.
Okay.
And take away all of the artificial boundaries because, if you're in vet care, you get something different if you're in aged care. Health hospitals will do one thing, primary care will do something else. So I think that, I would argue that's the main reason why we've got the ramping problems we have in this state at the moment and across Australia is because we've got a complete disconnect between the way in which primary care and GPs are funded and work and how the hospital system works.
So
and there's just a growing gap between the two.
So explain that to the layman person.
Well, because within the GP world, the funding system through Medicare is essentially an item of service payment system. The more widgets you do, the more you get paid. Whereas what I was involved in developing in the UK was shifting away from that from GPs to it being outcome focused. And so you actually got rewarded for if you had X number of people you were responsible for as a GP who had diabetes, if at the end of the year you could see that their diabetes had improved, you got an extra payment.
Wow.
So you're incentivized on outcomes,
To help.
not on inputs. And so our GP system works on inputs. It's item of service payments. The more widgets you do, the more you get paid, regardless of whether they have any benefit for you.
Not to mention, can you even get into a GP these days? You got to, like, if you're sick, you got to know you're going to be sick a week in advance before you. It's unbelievable.
Exactly. Whereas if the GPs were funded on the basis of having a registered population, and your basic pay was making sure you were accessible to those people when you were needed, and then you add the outcome component, you end up with a very different system. But if the funder isn't responsible for that bit and for paying the hospital bill, then why would you take that into account? Whereas that notion of putting all the money in one pot, then if I don't, and I remember going to Canada with Minister Hill to look at some of the innovation over there back when we were developing the concept of the new Royal Adelaide Hospital. And I think Minister Hill himself admitted he was stunned that his counterpart in Ontario was able to say, well, actually, if I think I'm going to get better value by having more aged care services in the community than putting the money into geriatrician beds in the hospital, I'll just do that. And they had the legitimacy and the power and the remit to do that. And so it's that sort of notion of putting everything in money into one pot and then having one body, because then they can look holistically across the services as well as the individuals to make sure you're getting better outcomes and better value for money.
So do you think the UK system is better than here? I mean, it's probably more than that question, but I guess in the sense that they have this power and authority to make decisions.
No, I mean, because I think so. Unfortunately, what's happened in the UK, because don't forget, I haven't been there for 20 years.
Yeah, because I often hear it's like we're lucky in Australia, right? We're lucky.
I certainly, because of the numerous years of austerity measures that have been put in place in the UK since the financial issues back in 2008. Then there are huge issues in the National Health Service. It's not the same National Health Service that I worked in at all. You've got some similar issues around the way in which GPs are operating. The biggest crisis at the moment in the UK is on dental, because there's virtually no NHS dental service, because it's just not paid well enough, and so people have opted into private, and so you've got huge issues. So no, I think that the UK is not where I'd be looking for good practice currently. So I think there are really good practice in some of the Scandinavian countries, some of the Canadian jurisdictions. There's some stuff happening in New Zealand as well. So I think there are a variety of things around that we could be drawing on to look at that different way of doing things to get better outcomes.
Is that something that you would like to do post-career, or do you think after Minda it's hang up the boots and go and travel the world? And
no, I'm not. I mean, I'm again, part of, unfortunately, I don't have, I'm not obsessed by work, but I'm equally not somebody who has huge pastimes. So I have no yearning to sail around the world or to do X, Y, and Z in a retirement phase. I equally have no desire to be on, given what I said about corporate boards, I have no desire to be have a portfolio of non-executive positions. But certainly, yes, I'm keen to put something back as I move out of operational type chief exec roles into the policy space. And so around those different models, but also my other real passion is that in all of the changes that have happened in recent years, I believe we have fundamentally undervalued and devalued care itself. And when I talk about care, I mean the basic humanity of the physical care of somebody. And across our systems now, that task is relegated to the lowest paid in our systems. You know, a lot of nurses now don't do hands-on care. Many of them do, but in order to progress in their careers, they have to move away from hands-on care into managerial or administrative roles.
It's not the same as it used to be.
Within aged care, within disability, you're talking about people being on, $26 an hour, with dealing with huge degree of complexity. So I want to do some work to look at how you value care in an economic way. And when we were developing the concept for the new Royal Adelaide Hospital, part of the reason why there are the single rooms, and all of those single rooms have a big picture window out to the parklands or if they're inward facing to green courtyards, is because there is a whole load of evidence that says even having a picture of a tree hanging in your hospital room helps you get better quicker. There's an economic reason for that green vista being there. It will have an impact on your length of stay.
It's an anthropological thing there, isn't it?
And so I believe we need to do the same around the actual care process.
It's that connection piece.
Yeah.
It does feel a bit lonely when you're in hospital.
And I think that if we need to put a real value on our frontline care staff having a relationship with the person they're providing the care for, and if we genuinely valued that, then we could demonstrate that it had a sort of economic impact in an assessment of how you run a service and the cost effectiveness of the service. So that's, and I'm talking to colleagues at Flinders University in the nursing and health sciences space who've got a common interest around this. So I'm hoping over the next few years to do some work around that.
Yeah, because you're studying at the moment. Again, is it?
Well, no, I'm not. Well, I'm in the process of being given an adjunct professorship at Flinders University with the health sciences and nursing school, because that's the area that I want to focus on. And I want to be able to have that relationship with an academic institution, and I think my observations is that Flinders is doing that sort of work at the moment and has got that passion around that. So I'm keen to be part of that.
Just going back to your point on the nurses, and I'm just thinking about the world that I live in, which is, helping large organisations and non-for-profits or whatnot, helping them through change. One thing that we get commented on is that, a lot on is that our people, our change managers, our team are always on site, whether it's out at in the mine site or or within the office building, we're on site, and our role of managing the human element of change is always about connection. It's about constant connection, communication, and being in there. And it's definitely not something that you can just do. You said communication earlier. It's not something you can just send an email out and then there's my way of communicating. It's actually, how do I meet Joe, Sarah, and Tim and understand who they are and what they're smelling, touching, feeling, and understand their perspective, so we're able to enact on this change. And I think it's very similar to what you're saying in regards to nursing, is if you can get to know someone and you can get them to feel like they belong as part of the community or the hospital system, or they feel like they're cared for, then naturally that's going to lift spirits. It's going to make them feel connected. I think there is definitely something in that.
Absolutely. And it's sort of, it's one of the frustrations currently that hopefully might change with the NDIS funding, for example, is that it doesn't fund handover time. So it won't fund for two staff to be there at the same time to have a conversation about what's happened.
It's unbelievable.
It doesn't fund supervision time. So these are costs that you're meant to absorb as an organisation, but which actually detract from the quality of the care and support you're providing. The other thing that reminds me is that, again, we're doing it at ECH, we're about to start doing it at Minda, is that I require any of our staff who aren't client-facing, so classically the back office, the finance, the HR, etc., that they have to spend a number of times a year shadowing a frontline member of staff, because I want everybody to be connected to that core purpose.
Absolutely.
And it's very easy if you're a finance person to be sitting
You
in your office, lose sight
of
of what you're there for. So that building that in, and it's a bit more challenging within a Minda environment, simply because we've also got to be really mindful that these are people's homes. They're not workplaces. And so we have to negotiate differently how you might have somebody shadowing. And that's what we've been working through with people with intellectual disabilities themselves about what they would like. So that's why it's taking a little bit longer to think about how we implement
It's much needed, and like you said, majority of people at Minda are connected to the cause as to why they're there, and ECH and all the above. So actually being able to see it is only going to, and being part of it is only going to connect them even more, which brings up your employee experience and then your customer experience on top of all that. Right, we're going to sort of start diving into some closing thoughts. I think if you had some, before I go into the quick fire questions, I want to just ask, if you had to encapsulate your entire journey in a single lesson or a message, how would you do that? What would that look like?
The one thing that constantly goes around in my head, which is sort of answering that question, and goes back to the issue of earrings.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
And it was when I was chief exec of Brighton and Hove.
Yeah.
And there was a little bit of a flurry from some of the local government, as though it's different, it's very political. I had 4 political parties in the council, 78 elected members. So a challenge just managing all of that dynamic as the chief exec. And at one point, the opposition made some comments about my earrings and indicated, which led to a flurry of letters in the press about how can this person be doing the job with earrings? They'll have a bone through their nose before you know it, or what, just bizarre stuff. Yeah, wow. And this wonderful woman, Doreen, and I've still got the cutting at home, wrote a little letter in saying, I've been around for 89 years, and over that time, I've actually worked out it's what happens between the ears rather than what's in the ears that matters.
Absolutely.
And that, to me, encapsulates, I think, that message. It's about be who you are and be focused on why you're there, and that should hold you in good stead.
Absolutely. I love that. If you were to give, I mean, you've quite openly said that you're coming towards the latter part of your career, and especially within sort of leadership and leading businesses. If you were to give any advice to some emerging leaders out there, what would that be?
So it's 2 things. I think it's making sure that you're doing a job that you actually want to do and have some passion about. And secondly, about always thinking about the job after next.
Yeah, okay.
Because to get the next job, you need to be performing really well in the existing job. And so if in going into that job, because often people might talk to me about, oh, this job's come up, should I apply? What do you think? And it's that sort of notion that, well, hang on, make sure that you're in a job that you're going to be performing well in, and you're not doing it just because it's a thing to tick on the list that you think you should have done this job to get the next one. Yeah. Because you won't get the next one if you're not
unless
performing
you do
well.
this well.
So thinking a bit more about that.
I love it. And last, before we jump into the quick fire, what excites you about the future of healthcare? I'm
not sure a lot does, to be honest. I think for me, I do think that because of a whole range of factors, we are going to see a resurgence of that sort of community voice, that user voice, that is going to help shape where we go, because the current arrangements can't continue. No. That fragmentation is just getting too many perverse outcomes, and it is going to inevitably, I think, lead to a cycle where we're back in that mode of having to think more clearly about what we're trying to do. And I do think that's potentially exciting. Yeah. And some of that may involve technology and other things, but, you know, as clever as AI might get and as helpful it might be, I don't particularly believe that's going to replace that issue of the actual touch.
Human connection.
A lot of process stuff it can deal with.
Yeah.
But the human connection, I think, still relies upon humans.
Absolutely. It's Maslow's hierarchy, isn't it? Right. Quick fire. Oh dear. What are you reading right now?
I have just finished I'm a crime reader.
Oh yeah.
But I don't like. I think it now gets described as cozy crime. Okay. So people like Vera, Anne Cleeve's books. Yeah. Which is, Vera's wonderful as a television program, but the books are even better. Yeah. For me, it's crime books which are set in a location as well, because I like that sense of place. Yeah. So there's I've just finished the Chris Hammer ones set in Australia, which have been really good. Yeah, great. So they and I am an avid reader. I read every night before I go to bed. I read when I'm travelling a lot, and I go through probably at least a book a week.
So smashing them out. Yeah. Do you read much self-development books or leadership books or business books? And if you do, is there any that sort of stood out for you over the years?
Simple answer is no.
No.
I don't. I occasionally read an industry-related books.
Yeah.
So there's a book that came out a year or so ago called The Careless State, for
Yep.
example, which is an academics book, and it's about that whole issue about how in shifting to that corporate governance model, to procurement models,
Yep.
we have taken care out of our system,
Mm-hmm.
whether you're looking at childcare through to hospitals, etc.
Yeah.
But no, it's part of, again, keeping that separation of work and personal.
Yeah.
Is I don't tend to, and I'm probably a bit cocky because of my psychology background, that most of the
stuff is hogwash anyway. Yeah. What's one lesson that's taking you the longest to learn?
I think it is that issue about just being myself. As I always thought I'd be being myself, but I know I then drift away, and then something happens that brings me back to that. So it's, and I say, I can see that in my career in terms of, taking my earrings to go to a job and then being told I don't need it. So it's that, and also a learning early on, which I hope I haven't. I think I stopped replicating fairly early on, is that classic thing about the team around you. Part of the huge benefit I've had with Minda is because of that history and most of the senior team going.
Yeah.
I had to rebuild an entire new senior team. And I'm very clear that I need a team around me that complements rather than being like me.
Yeah.
So I'm not operational detail. I need very good operational detail people.
Yeah.
And incredibly privileged that a number of my team now have worked with me in different roles in the past over the last 20 years and have chosen to come and work again with me as part of what we're trying to do at Minda.
Beautiful.
But that basic thing about don't appoint people because they're like you.
Yeah.
Because that's probably the last thing you actually need.
Yeah, absolutely. If you could have coffee with one current or historical figure, who would it be? Probably not Margaret Thatcher.
No, it wouldn't be Mark. Such a scar on my life, I have to say. I think that I would like to. I think there's two different people, I guess. One is Quentin Crisp. So Quentin Crisp was a famous homosexual.
Okay.
Who struggled through all of the illegalities, etc., in the 40s and the 50s in the UK. Came to prominence because he wrote a book in the late 70s, I think it was, called The Naked Civil Servant, that got turned into a TV drama. And he spent the latter years of his life living in New York. But it's just a fascinating individual. And then the other person, because they just, again, I've had a relationship on and off, given what I've been saying earlier on, is Florence Nightingale. Because it's sort of, I'm just intrigued as to what she was really like, because there's so much mythology around who she was and how and what she created, and so actually it would be a three-way, because it would be her and Mary Seacole. And so Mary Seacole was around at the same time as Florence Nightingale, but was Afro-Caribbean. And so got forgotten in the history books until relatively recently. Until the last sort of 50,
but has much impact.
Yeah.
Amazing. What's some of the best advice that you've ever received?
Well, there's the bit about what's in the head rather than between the ears rather than in the ears. The best advice. I think I've already said it. It is just those amazing people that I've had the privilege of working with who said to me, put the earrings back. The same with Barbara Young when I turned up for that first proper job in health outside of HOE9, sent me home to change because I turned up in the suit.
So just be you.
Yeah, so did that. And I think, and the person who taught that general management course in 1987 that I went on, I'm still friends with, and he retired long ago, but he always then used his advice to me as the worst advice, which was the same thing. It was, you won't get anywhere if you don't take those earrings out and grow up.
Okay, there you go. What's one habit that holds you back the most?
I think it is now probably it goes again. What I was saying earlier about being the professional extrovert and the introvert. I know that now I've got less tolerance for some of the additional non-work stuff.
Yeah.
Don't like going to social events just for the sake of you're in this set and you get invited along to be part of that.
Yeah.
So I think that's...
So saying no is probably...
Yeah. So I'm getting better at saying no, but equally I realise that for Minda and the presence of Minda, some of that is still important.
Absolutely, yeah. What's one of your biggest pet peeves?
Okay, so... and I understand the importance of this, but if I could, it is a pet peeve because it really annoys me every day, but it is a big social issue, and it's private education.
Okay.
If I was dictator for the day, I would abolish all private education. I think that we're setting ourselves up to fail as a community and a society because we put kids on separate paths from very early on, and then it creates divisions. So I am anti-private education.
Okay, my kids go to a private school.
Well, and I know, and it's sort of...
But you're right, it's part of my decision-making is that they will hang... I went to a private school and the people in which I connected with are still in my life today and they're flourishing in their careers, and I think it's more the network in which I am paying for more so than the schooling in itself. So,
absolutely,
and that's exactly what you're saying,
and that's right. And I think it just then means that the state schools thus get diminished because they don't have the diversity of the population. They don't have all those groups reflected necessarily within them. So
I've never really thought about it like that.
So that's my pet peeve. And then because from that then flows all of the unnecessary transport that happens every day that clogs up our city because of people getting kids to schools on other sides of the city to where they live, and
absolutely,
so adds a lot of stuff, I think.
Yeah, no doubt. If you could pay someone to do one of your chores, what chore would it be?
I honestly don't have an answer to that. I don't think, because part of how I relax is doing some of the usual stuff. I mean, the thing I do pay somebody to do is to wash and iron my shirts.
Oh, really?
See, but any other
wash and iron. So you just take them, drop them off somewhere.
Yeah, take them, drop them off, and then go back a week later.
Pick them up.
I don't possess an iron in.
So you got enough for 2 weeks in your wardrobe.
Least, So, but that's the thing which I would. Whereas cutting the grass, I love painting.
Yeah, it is
because it's just so different.
And it's brain deading.
Exactly. I can just do it with earpods in and listen to podcasts or whatever.
Yeah,
very happy doing that sort of thing.
Yeah, crime podcasts as well.
No. Still a lot of BBC Radio 4 programs that I grew up with.
Okay.
There's a long run. The longest running soap opera in the world, I think, is called The Archers.
Oh, yeah.
Which is on radio and started between the world wars.
Oh, wow.
And it's in a farming community. And originally it was about educational around farming and the importance of food production, particularly during the Second World War. And it's 15 minutes every day, an omnibus edition on a Sunday for an hour and a half or whatever.
Yeah.
And so I listen to that religiously.
Yeah, wow.
And I have done for the last 40 years.
There you go. Very good. What's the first thing you would do if you become invisible?
Work out a way of doing away with private education.
Okay, very good. What's the most useless talent that you have?
Oh God, what useless talent do I have? It's not. I do think I've got a particular talent for baking, which is not.
Well, that's useful.
That's useful because so that's one of my things. All my team get a birthday cake that I've made on their birthdays. What's my most useful? I don't know.
You're good at everything.
Everything. I can tell you one thing that I'm not good at, certainly, and you wouldn't want me for anything involving throwing a ball.
Oh, really? Sports, not anything?
I have no. I mean, I love soccer.
Yeah.
I watch a lot of soccer. Could never play soccer.
Yeah.
Have no, but I can't throw a ball. I can't play tennis because I just. So yeah,
Two left feet.
Well, so the only sport I do is running.
Yeah, okay.
I run nearly every day.
Yeah, great.
But I can't do anything which involves a ball. It just doesn't work for me.
Beautiful. And commonly known as the dad joke, right? What's your best shit joke?
Again, I'm not a great joke teller. The only joke in my repertoire goes back to when I was a 5-year-old, which is, what did the Martian say to the petrol pump?
What did the Martian say to the petrol pump?
Get that finger out of your ear while I'm talking to you.
That's horrible. And it's supposed to be. Well, beautiful. Thank you so much today for your time, David. It's been a great and amazing chat. You've had a pretty eventful journey. I think one thing that comes to my mind is one of the core values here at SynergyIQ, which is grit. You've set your sight on what you want to do and what you want to achieve, and connected yourself to the purpose throughout your career, which is, kudos to you and all that you've achieved. Thank you for the work that you've done here in South Australia. I know that you're going to continue doing some more great things over the next coming years, and looking forward to seeing the strategy come out for your plans with Minda, and then what you plan on doing after that. I think we're all going to be watching in anticipation. So thank you very much for your time.
Thank you. It's been a real pleasure.
And that's it from us, everyone. Take care, and we'll catch you next time. Thanks for listening to the podcast all. You can check out the show notes if there was anything of interest to you, and find out more about us at synergyiq.com.au. I am going to ask though, if you did like the podcast, it would absolutely mean the world to me if you could subscribe, rate and review. And if you didn't like it, that's all right too. There's no need to do anything. Take care, guys. All the best.